Alright everybody, we're here today to talk about what exactly we mean by communication. Now, let me start by saying that a speech class is a little bit different than some other classes because we're going to be studying things that you at least feel like you're pretty familiar with. Obviously, you've been using language to communicate verbally with people for a long time at this point. But what we're going to do several times in this class is look at things that you think you understand well and cause you to stop and think about them a little bit and hopefully improve your understanding of them and how you can then apply that to class. So that's why we're starting out with this most basic concept of communication. This video is going to follow along pretty closely with Chapter 1, Section 1 of your textbook. So I would encourage you to read that section before you watch the video, or at least follow along with it while you're watching the video. So the question is, what exactly do we mean by communication? Well, if you're looking in your textbook, you should see the definition that communication is the process of sending and receiving messages. Now, when I ask people in class, what do you think we mean by communication? Very often I get a response like, it's talking, or it's when one person is saying things to another, or something like that. I like using this specific definition from the text, though, for a few reasons. Notice there are several implications of this definition. First of all, it lets us know that there have to be two different people involved, one person who is sending and another person who is receiving messages. Notice that both of these are actions. There are two different actions taking place. One person is sending and the other person's receiving. It's not just one person broadcasting information. And finally, you should notice that in communication, people are exchanging messages. And as we're going to explain on this slide, that's actually a pretty important idea. So who's involved? As we said, you have to have both a sender and a receiver. So right now, you could make the argument that this isn't necessarily communication, at least certainly not the process of me recording this into my computer. It doesn't become communication until you listen to this at home and take notes, and really even then it doesn't complete the communication process until I get some feedback from you on whether or not you understood my messages. So what do we mean by a message? This is a really important idea. And if you can understand this idea, you'll understand why we take all the time in speech class we do to talk about some basic concepts. A message is different than an idea. Ideas exist in the mind. So you have an idea in your head, and that's the only place it exists. You cannot take that idea out of your head and hand it to somebody else. You have to go through a process that we call encoding to turn your idea into symbols to form messages. You have to use things like words and written language and images and gestures and facial expressions, none of which have inherent meaning of their own. Those are all symbols. It's a kind of code that we've all agreed means something. Then the receiver has to decode those messages back into ideas in their head. And that's when the communication process is completed. So if you take a look at this picture here, we should see the communication process in action and sort of illustrate what I'm talking about. So over here, this guy is our sender. He has an idea in his head. This is his idea right here, this picture of a tree. He wants to communicate that idea to this person over here, who's going to be the receiver. So he takes that idea and he encodes it into a message. In this case, he uses spoken language and says, it's a big tree. So the receiver receives that message and decodes it into an idea of their own, but they end up with a different tree in their head because this message did not adequately communicate the idea. Clearly, there'd be more information the sender would need to encode into their message. And they could encode any kind of things, anything they do symbolically to try and represent that idea that exists only in their head becomes part of the message. So they might have said, it's a Christmas tree. That would help right there. They might also use physical gestures to indicate the size of the tree. Maybe they would point to another tree somewhere else. Maybe they would tell a story about a similar tree that this other person has seen. I don't really know. These people are having a complicated conversation about trees. But the point is that unlike a computer where you can copy a file onto a flash drive and then put it in another computer and get an exact replica, the only way we have to get ideas from one person to another are by turning them into messages. So let's take a look at this diagram again in a more sort of symbolic way. This is pretty directly taken from your textbook, and I would highly recommend being familiar with this concept. So again, we have a sender and we have a receiver. The sender has an idea that's floating in their head. In order to get that idea to the receiver, they have to encode it into a message. The receiver then decodes that message into an idea of their own. And then the communication process completes when the receiver re-encodes their new idea into what we call feedback, which the sender has to decode. So again, using this video as an example, this will only really be communication when we meet again in class and I get to understand whether or not the messages that I use to convey these ideas made sense. So think about the implications of that for your speeches in class. If, for example, you're doing your partner introduction speech and you have the idea that this is a really interesting, exciting person that you want to introduce to the class, well, you encode that idea into a message, which the class then decodes into an idea about that person of their own. And everything you do gets encoded into that message, and that's the only way we have to access the idea. So even if you think the person is really interesting and exciting, but your body language and your tone of voice and your use of gestures encodes the idea that they're kind of boring, that's all we have to work with, and that's what we will decode. Likewise, when you're an audience member in class and your classmates are giving a speech, you're communicating with them. You're encoding that feedback to them all the time. And if you're sitting there in the desk all slumped over, not looking like you're paying attention, they're going to decode that feedback to mean that the speech isn't very good and it's going to make them sad. Even if you are really interested and you just listen really well with your head on the desk, it's not going to be decoded correctly. The last thing we want to talk about in this video is something called interference. Interference are the things that happen that cause the communication process to break down. And as we're going through these, I want you to think about how they might pop up in our classroom. The first kind of interference I want to talk about is attitudinal interference. These words seem kind of complicated, but attitude just means it has to do with your attitude. Attitudinal interference means the speaker or the audience's attitude towards a topic interferes with the communication process. So if you are giving us a speech about something that you find personally fascinating and the audience isn't interested in it at all, there might be some attitudinal interference. Now remember, as an audience member, you're going to be actively involved in the communication process. So even if you don't feel super interested and excited in what they're talking about, you're going to work through that because maybe eventually you will be interested in it once you understand why the speaker, the sender, is so excited about it. But likewise, as a speaker, you are going to make an effort to choose speech topics that the people in class are going to be excited about and find interesting. Also, keep in mind that this can come up when people have kind of a negative attitude about the speech class. If you aren't that interested in doing what you're supposed to do for class, if you don't think it's worth your time, or you don't like going to school, or you don't think Mr. Kennedy deserves to tell you what to do, or something like that, that might cause some attitudinal interference and communication isn't going to take place, and everyone will be sad. Another kind of interference that we might encounter is social or cultural interference. When the speaker or audience's views, where the speaker or audience views the other as being outside of their social circle or culture. Think about the different social circles and cultures we have represented in our class. Think about the people in our class who only ever take honors and AP classes, and this might be the only class they're taking this semester that isn't an accelerated class. Think about the people in our class who are never going to take an honors or AP class. Think about the seniors that we have and the underclassmen that we have, the people that can drive, the people who are years away from getting their license, the people who plan to go to college, the people who know they aren't going to college, the athletes, the people who are into computer games, the people who are into any number of things. that can cause social or cultural interference, which is part of the reason why we're doing activities here at the beginning of the year, like getting to know you speeches, so we start to break down some of those social or cultural circles that will cause interference. We might also run into educational interference when there's a difference in the speaker and audience's level of education. And when you're thinking about that, you might immediately jump to the conclusion of like understanding words or terminology. Often we call that jargon. If for example, when we do our demonstration speeches, if you're talking about baseball and because you're a baseball player and have played baseball for years and you start using a lot of complicated terminology that the people in the class don't know, that's an example of educational interference. And so you have to make sure that the audience understands what they need to understand about baseball in order to understand what's going on in your speech. So educational interference means a lot more than, there are seniors in the class and freshmen in the class, and the seniors have, taken government or something like that. And then the last one I'm going to talk about, which is actually kind of important, really important, is environmental interference. Environmental interference occurs when something in the speaking environment disrupts the communication process. Think about our classroom. The next time you're in there, look around the classroom and think about what things are in there that might make communication difficult. Do you usually find the room too hot? Well, keep that in mind and dress appropriately when you're in the audience so that won't distract you. Or if you find it too cold, bring a sweatshirt. Is it right before lunch and that's going to make you tired? Make sure to get a drink on your way to class or something like that. Think about all those things in the environment that might cause a problem and start thinking about what we can do to cut down on them. So that's the main things I wanted to cover about the communication process. Again, make sure you have some notes from this video that you can use on the quiz in class on Thursday. And make sure to review Chapter 1, Section 1 of your textbook to help you out with this material.